Mr. Thompson was a teacher who held a reputation in the town. He had taught mathematics for years and was known for his sharp mind and the strictness he maintained in his classroom. Every student who passed through his class had to meet high expectations. He expected perfection, and more often than not, he got it. His colleagues admired his skills, and the parents of his students were proud that their children were learning from such a talented educator. Mr. Thompson had a way of making people feel small if they couldn't keep up with his way of thinking, and he was used to having his intellect admired. One evening, the school was hosting a community event. It was a gathering for parents, teachers, and local figures to come together and discuss education, learning, and success. The event was meant to show off the talents of the teachers, and naturally, Mr. Thompson had prepared a demonstration. He was planning to show the audience just how smart he was. He had a difficult math problem in mind, a challenge that would leave everyone in awe of his intelligence. After all, he believed that the average person would struggle with it, and he was more than ready to prove it. As the evening unfolded, Mr. Thompson was talking with a few other teachers when he noticed Mary in the crowd. Mary wasn't part of the educational world. She was a simple woman, a mother who worked as a secretary at a local firm. She was known around town for being friendly and hardworking, but she didn't carry the same prestige as others in the room. She had a soft, unassuming presence, always wearing a warm smile and listening intently to others. Her life was simple, nothing extraordinary about it. Or so it seemed. Seeing Mary among the guests, Mr. Thompson decided this would be the perfect opportunity to demonstrate his superior skills. He turned to his colleague with a sly grin and said, "Let's give Mary here a little challenge, shall we? Let's see how she does with something complex." His colleague was skeptical but agreed to the idea, not understanding the implications. Mr. Thompson, full of confidence, approached Mary. "Mary, how would you like to take a shot at solving a math problem for us?" he asked with a tone that made it clear he didn't expect much from her. "Don't worry, it's nothing too difficult." Mary, caught off guard by the unexpected attention, smiled politely. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice calm and warm. "But I'll give it a try." Mr. Thompson smirked to himself. This was going to be easy. Mary wasn't trained in mathematics. She worked with numbers in her office job, but this problem would be beyond her, he was sure of it. He quickly wrote a complicated equation on the board, one involving algebraic expressions, variables, and as the weeks passed, Mary's life continued in much the same way. She went to work, took care of her family, and stayed out of the spotlight. Yet, the aftermath of her math challenge with Mr. Thompson had left a lasting mark on her. Despite her desire for privacy, the impact of what had happened was impossible to ignore. Word had spread beyond the small town, and before long, people from nearby areas were talking about her. Mary had become somewhat of a local legend, a symbol of unexpected brilliance. Yet, she didn't seek fame or attention. She was content with her life, choosing to continue quietly helping others in whatever way she could. Her colleagues at work continued to seek her out for advice on everything from simple calculations to more complex problems. As more people learned about her talents, they began to see her as someone they could turn to when they needed help. It wasn't just about numbers anymore. Her quiet wisdom and humble demeanor made people trust her more. She had become the kind of person others felt comfortable with, the one who would never make them feel small for asking questions, no matter how simple or difficult they might be. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson was facing the consequences of the public challenge he had made. In the weeks following the event, he found himself wrestling with his own identity. For so long, he had prided himself on being the authority in the room, the one everyone looked up to. But that moment with Mary had shattered his confidence. He couldn't help but feel like a fraud. His colleagues, who had always respected him, now seemed to look at him differently. The students, too, began to see him as just another teacher, someone who was no longer the undisputed expert in the classroom. The respect he had once commanded felt a little less certain. For Mr. Thompson, the hardest part was admitting to himself that he had been wrong. He had spent his entire career assuming that intelligence came only from degrees, formal education, and years of hard work in the classroom. But Mary had shown him that true brilliance didn't need any of that. It could come from anywhere, from anyone. And the most remarkable thing was that she had never sought to show off or prove herself. Her humility was what set her apart from all the elite mathematicians he had known. One afternoon, unable to shake the feeling that he had to learn more, Mr. Thompson made the decision to seek Mary out one last time. This time, however, it wasn't about asking for an explanation of her math skills or trying to understand how she had learned it all. Instead, it was about understanding her. It was about acknowledging that he had something to learn from her, not the other way around. He called her at work and asked if they could meet. "Mary," he said on the phone, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened. And I'd like to talk to you again, if you don't mind. I've learned a lot from you, and I think I still have a lot to understand." Mary, though a little surprised by the request, agreed. They arranged to meet at the same cafe where they had spoken before. When Mr. Thompson arrived, he was different. He wasn't the proud, confident teacher who had once felt superior. Instead, he seemed humbled, even a little nervous. Mary greeted him warmly as usual. "It's good to see you again, Mr. Thompson. What's on your mind?" she asked, her tone inviting and calm. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about what happened between us," Mr. Thompson began, sitting down across from her. "And I realize now that it wasn't just about math. You've shown me something that goes beyond equations and formulas. I've spent my life thinking that intelligence was something you had to earn through formal education, through degrees and years of study. But you've taught me that that's not the case." Mary listened carefully, sensing that he was opening up in a way he hadn't before. "I didn't mean to teach you anything," she said, her voice gentle. "I never set out to prove a point. I just love solving problems. It's something I've done for as long as I can remember. It's not about being the smartest person in the room. It's about finding joy in the process." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. "That's what I've been missing," he said. "I've always been so focused on the results, on the grades, on the recognition. I never stopped to think about why I was doing it in the first place. But hearing you talk about math as a joy, as a puzzle to solve, has made me realize how much I've lost sight of that. I've been teaching to impress, not to inspire." Mary smiled softly, understanding what he meant. "The thing is, Mr. Thompson, learning doesn't have to be about impressing others. It's about understanding something new, even if no one else notices. For me, math is about the thrill of discovering something no one else has seen before. It's not about being the best, it's about enjoying the journey." Mr. Thompson sat back, taking in her words. He felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. For the first time in a long time, he realized that he didn't have to prove himself to anyone. He didn't need to be the smartest person in the room. He could just be someone who loved learning, who loved helping others learn, and that was enough. As their conversation continued, Mr. Thompson asked Mary if she would consider giving a lecture at the school, just to share her story with others. He wanted students to see that intelligence wasn't about qualifications or fancy degrees. It was about passion, curiosity, and the willingness to challenge the status quo. Mary was hesitant at first, not used to speaking in front of large groups. But after some encouragement, she agreed. She realized that her story could help others, especially those who might feel like they didn't fit the mold of a typical scholar. She could show them that anyone, regardless of their background, could be brilliant in their own way. The lecture was scheduled, and when the day arrived, the auditorium was packed. Students, teachers, and even parents filled the seats. Mr. Thompson was there, sitting quietly in the back, his heart swelling with pride. He knew that this moment wasn't just about Mary. It was about the change she had sparked in him, in the way he saw the world, and in how he would teach from that point forward. Mary stood at the front of the room, a little nervous, but determined. As she began to speak, her words were simple but powerful. She spoke about her love for math, her journey of self-learning, and the importance of following your passions, no matter how unconventional they might seem. She talked about how intelligence wasn't just about being the best, it was about finding joy in the process of discovery. By the end of her talk, the room was silent. Everyone was deep in thought, reflecting on her words. For many, it was a revelation, a new way of thinking about learning, about intelligence, and about life itself. As the audience began to applaud, Mr. Thompson couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. He had learned from Mary in ways he never could have imagined. And as he watched her stand there, speaking with such poise and grace, he realized that this was just the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. Mary, once a simple secretary, had taught an entire community a valuable lesson. And in doing so, she had changed the way they would all think about intelligence, learning, and the pursuit of knowledge. It wasn't about titles or degrees, it was about the passion to learn, to grow, and to share what you knew with others. As the applause echoed in the auditorium, Mary smiled, knowing that she had finally found a way to make a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone around her. As time passed, the ripple effect of Mary's unexpected brilliance continued to spread. What had been a small event at a community gathering had turned into something much bigger. People in the town started to see her in a different light. She was no longer just the friendly, approachable secretary they had always known. Mary had become an enigma, someone with a rare talent that no one had expected. The rumors about the math problem spread like wildfire. The news reached far beyond the school. Some people spoke about it as though Mary had performed a miracle. Others saw it as a reminder that true genius could come from the most unlikely places. Her story became a topic of conversation in homes, at work, and at local businesses. Everyone was curious about how someone like her could have solved such a complex equation without formal training. At work, Mary felt the effects of the newfound attention. Her colleagues, who had always respected her work ethic, now saw her as more than just a secretary. They started asking her for advice, simple questions at first, like help with budgeting or figuring out percentages for projects. But as the days went on, the questions grew more complex. Some people asked her to help them solve problems with their kids' schoolwork. Others came to her for guidance on financial calculations. Mary handled it all with the same calm, methodical approach she had used to solve the math problem at the event. She never flaunted her knowledge. She simply offered help when it was asked of her, always with a gentle smile. But while Mary was quietly going about her daily life, Mr. Thompson was having a much harder time processing the aftermath of the event. His life had not gone back to normal. In fact, it seemed that everything had changed. People began to talk about his defeat at the gathering, some even mocking him behind his back. Mr. Thompson had spent years cultivating a reputation as one of the brightest minds in his field, but that single moment, that brief interaction with Mary, had shaken his confidence to the core. At first, Mr. Thompson tried to brush it off. He told himself that it was just a fluke, that Mary had somehow gotten lucky. He convinced himself that he was still the better teacher, the more capable educator. But as the days went by, the whispers continued, and he couldn't help but question himself. He had always prided himself on being the smartest person in the room, and now he was forced to confront the fact that someone with no formal education had outsmarted him in front of everyone. As he walked through the halls of the school, he noticed that his colleagues were no longer looking at him the same way. There was a certain distance in their interactions, a lack of the admiration he had grown used to. The students, too, seemed less impressed by his teachings. They were beginning to ask questions about Mary, not about him. It wasn't just that they were curious about her skills, they were starting to look up to her. They saw her as someone who was just like them, someone they could relate to. And in many ways, that made her even more inspiring than Mr. Thompson. She was living proof that you didn't have to follow the traditional path to success. You didn't need a degree, or years of formal study, to be brilliant. This was a truth Mr. Thompson had never truly accepted before. He had spent his career teaching students that the key to success was through years of hard work and the pursuit of academic credentials. But here was Mary, a woman who had never set foot in a college classroom, showing him that genius wasn't bound by the walls of a university. She had achieved what many of his students, and even he himself, could only dream of. And she had done it quietly, without the need for validation. One afternoon, Mr. Thompson made up his mind. He needed to speak to Mary again, to understand her better. He couldn't let this go. He needed answers. So, he called her up at work and asked if they could meet. Mary agreed, though she was a little surprised by the request. They arranged to meet at a local cafe, where they could talk in a more casual setting. When they met, Mr. Thompson was noticeably different. He wasn't the confident, self-assured teacher he had once been. Instead, he seemed almost humble, as though he were the one seeking answers. Mary greeted him warmly, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "Mr. Thompson, what's on your mind?" she asked, her voice calm and welcoming. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," he began, his voice quieter than usual. "And I've realized something. You've shown me something I didn't fully understand before. I've spent my whole life teaching that education is the key to success, that you need degrees, experience, and recognition to be considered truly smart. But you've shown me that there's more to it than that. You've made me question everything I've believed about intelligence." Mary listened intently as he spoke. She could tell that he was struggling, not just with the idea of her brilliance, but with the fact that she had taught him something he hadn't learned in all his years of formal education. "I want to understand," he continued. "How did you learn all this? How did you develop such a strong understanding of math without ever going to school for it? What was your process?" Mary took a deep breath, considering how to answer. She had never really thought of herself as anything special. She wasn't a trained mathematician or a scholar. She was just someone who loved solving problems, who had a passion for numbers and patterns. "It's not something I can really explain in one conversation," she said finally. "It's just that I've always loved math. From a young age, I started reading books on the subject. I didn't have any formal training, but I just kept learning, one step at a time. And every time I solved a problem, it felt like a small victory. It's a process of understanding, not memorizing. It's about finding the joy in solving a puzzle, not about impressing anyone." Her words resonated deeply with Mr. Thompson. He had spent his life teaching students how to solve problems quickly and efficiently, but he had never considered that the true joy of math might come from the process itself, not just the result. As Mary spoke, he realized that he had been so focused on grades, qualifications, and accolades that he had forgotten what it truly meant to love learning. She had reminded him that intelligence didn't have to be about the accolades, it could simply be about the quiet joy of discovery. By the end of their conversation, Mr. Thompson felt a shift within himself. He had learned more from Mary in the past few days than he had in all his years of teaching. And as he left the cafe, he made a promise to himself: he would start to approach his work differently. He would focus less on credentials and more on the love of learning. He would teach his students to find joy in the process of discovery, just as Mary had done for herself. Mary, for her part, didn't see herself as anyone special. She was simply someone who loved solving problems. But her encounter with Mr. Thompson had opened her eyes as well. It had shown her that her quiet passion could have an impact. And while she didn't seek recognition, she knew that her story had a deeper meaning for those around her. It wasn't just about math, it was about believing in oneself, about finding joy in what you love, and about challenging the world's expectations. The days following the event were filled with whispers and curiosity. The town was still buzzing from what had happened at the school gathering. Mary had become the subject of countless conversations. People were amazed by her unexpected brilliance. They couldn't stop talking about how she had effortlessly solved that complex math problem when no one, least of all Mr. Thompson, had expected her to. Some even called it a miracle, while others were simply baffled. It wasn't every day that someone came along and shattered preconceived notions in such a dramatic way. For Mary, life continued on as usual. She still went to work every day at the office, took care of her family, and carried on with her routines. Despite the attention she was receiving, she kept a low profile. She wasn't looking for fame or recognition. In fact, she felt a little uncomfortable with all the sudden attention. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight. But she also knew that what had happened at the event was not about her seeking approval. It had always been about her love for math and the quiet joy she got from solving problems. But despite her desire for privacy, things were starting to change around her. People began to treat her differently. At work, her colleagues started to look at her with a new level of respect. Some even approached her, asking for help with basic math questions or for advice on how to think through problems. It wasn't anything major, but it was clear that they saw her in a new light. They had always known her as the friendly, hard-working secretary, but now they were beginning to realize there was more to her than that. She wasn't just an office worker, she was someone with a talent that could not be ignored. The unexpected recognition wasn't confined to her workplace. At the local coffee shop, the barista who served her regularly now greeted her with an air of admiration. "I heard about what happened at the school event," he said one morning, smiling warmly. "That was amazing. I didn't know you were so good at math." Mary simply smiled and nodded, trying not to let it get to her head. "Thank you," she said, keeping her tone modest. She had always believed in keeping a humble attitude, no matter how much recognition she received. She didn't want to appear as though she was seeking praise. But deep down, she couldn't deny that a small part of her was flattered. It wasn't every day that someone recognized her for something she loved doing. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson found himself struggling with the aftermath of the event. He had been shaken by the experience, though he didn't let it show outwardly. As a teacher who prided himself on his intellectual superiority, he had never imagined that a simple woman like Mary could outshine him in such a public way. It wasn't just the fact that she had solved the problem, it was the way she had done it. She had approached it with a calm confidence, solving the equation with such ease that it had left him speechless. He found himself questioning his own abilities. How could someone with no formal education and no training in mathematics outperform him in front of a crowd? He had been the one with the credentials, the degrees, the experience. And yet, here was Mary, someone with none of those things, who had shown him up without even trying. Mr. Thompson couldn't stop thinking about her. He kept replaying the moment in his mind, trying to understand how she had done it. He had assumed that math was something that could only be mastered through years of study, through rigorous academic training. But Mary had proven him wrong. Her ability to solve the problem so effortlessly made him feel like his years of education had been meaningless. It wasn't just about the math, it was about the realization that intelligence couldn't be confined to a classroom. It could come from anywhere. He became obsessed with trying to figure out what made Mary different. He spent hours in his office, looking over his textbooks and lectures, trying to find some way to explain how she had solved the problem. He even began to research self-taught mathematicians, hoping to find some insight into how people like Mary could develop such extraordinary skills without formal training. But every time he thought he had an answer, it only raised more questions. It wasn't long before Mr. Thompson decided that he needed to speak to Mary again. He couldn't just let this go. He had to know how she had done it. He had to understand her secret. One day, after work, he made his way to the office where Mary worked. He had called ahead and arranged to meet her. When he arrived, she greeted him with a friendly smile, though she could tell he was a little nervous. "Mr. Thompson, what brings you here?" she asked, her voice warm and inviting. I've been thinking a lot about what happened the other day, he said, his voice a little unsure. And well, I want to learn more about how you solved that math problem. I mean, I'm a teacher, and yet you solved it faster and more accurately than I did. I have to know how you did it. Mary paused for a moment, considering his request. She could tell he was genuinely curious, but she wasn't sure how much she wanted to share. She wasn't used to talking about her love for math, let alone explaining how she had taught herself. But after a moment, she decided to give him an answer. It's really quite simple, Mr. Thompson, she began. I've always loved puzzles. Math is just one big puzzle to me. I don't approach it the way most people do. I don't focus on memorizing formulas or methods. I just focus on understanding the problem and breaking it down step by step. It's not about speed or trying to impress anyone. It's about taking your time, seeing the connections, and finding the solution. Mr. Thompson listened intently, absorbing her words. He had never heard anyone explain math in such a way. To him, math had always been about rules and formulas, about getting the right answer as quickly as possible. But Mary was telling him that it was about something deeper, something more intuitive. It was about understanding the problem, not just solving it. Her words resonated with him more than he expected. He had always prided himself on being the best, but now, in the face of someone who didn't care about being the best, he felt small. Mary had shown him that there was more to knowledge than what could be taught in a classroom. It was about curiosity, about a desire to learn for the sake of learning, and about finding joy in the process of discovery. As they talked, Mr. Thompson began to realize that he had a lot to learn from Mary. She wasn't just a student in his eyes now, she was a teacher in her own right. And though he had been reluctant to admit it, he was grateful for the lesson she had given him. It wasn't just about math. It was about the way she viewed the world, the way she approached challenges, and the way she had shown him that intelligence didn't have to be formal or conventional. By the end of their conversation, Mr. Thompson left with a new understanding. He still didn't fully grasp how Mary had developed her talents, but he had learned something far more valuable. He had learned that true intelligence came from within, from a passion for learning and a willingness to think differently. And for the first time in a long while, Mr. Thompson felt like he had much more to learn, not just from textbooks, but from the people around him. The silence in the room was palpable. As Mary stepped back from the board, the audience remained frozen in shock. No one knew what to say. They had all expected her to struggle, to stumble, to fail under the pressure of such a complex math problem. But she didn't. She solved it with an ease that seemed almost effortless, and the answer was correct. Mr. Thompson, who had been certain that this was going to be an easy display of his superior intellect, stood there, blinking in disbelief. He couldn't quite process what had just happened. His mind raced as he looked at the equation on the board, and then back at Mary. She wasn't a mathematician. She wasn't even a teacher. She was just a simple woman, someone who worked at a local office. How could she have solved it so easily? Mary, however, didn't seem fazed. She didn't look for praise or recognition, she simply stood there, quietly waiting. The calmness in her demeanor made her seem even more impressive. She wasn't boasting or celebrating her success. She didn't need to. Her quiet confidence was enough to leave a lasting impression on everyone in the room. The moment stretched out for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, trying to recover his composure. "That was impressive," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. "But how did you do it?" he asked, his curiosity beginning to outweigh his pride. Mary smiled gently. "It's just a matter of breaking it down," she explained. "I saw the problem, and I just took it step by step. It's like solving a puzzle. You don't rush through it, you just work through it slowly and carefully." Mr. Thompson nodded, though he was still clearly taken aback. He had always believed that solving math problems was a skill that required years of study, formal education, and a strong academic background. Mary didn't have any of those. She wasn't trained in the way he was. And yet, here she was, solving the problem with the ease of someone who had spent years studying math at the highest level. The crowd around them seemed to be processing the same thoughts. They had expected Mary to be just like any other average person, but she wasn't. There was something remarkable about her. Slowly, people began to murmur to each other, still in disbelief. One woman near the front of the room whispered to her friend, "Did she really just solve that? She's just a secretary, right? How could she do that?" Her friend nodded, equally stunned. "I've never seen anything like that before." She didn't even seem to hesitate. "It's like she's done this 100 times." Mary heard the whispers, but she didn't mind. She wasn't looking for praise or recognition. She had never wanted to be the center of attention. Her love for math wasn't about impressing people. It was something personal, a quiet joy she had discovered for herself years ago. She had always been fascinated by numbers, equations, and patterns. They made sense to her in a way that nothing else did. She had never sought validation from others. For her, solving problems was simply about the process, the satisfaction of finding the solution. But even so, she couldn't ignore the way people were beginning to look at her. Some were amazed, others confused, and a few were even envious. It was strange, but Mary didn't mind. She had never felt the need to explain herself to anyone. She had always known her worth, even if the world around her didn't always see it. Mr. Thompson, however, was struggling to come to terms with what had just happened. He had spent his entire career teaching, molding the minds of students, and building his reputation as one of the finest math teachers in the area. And yet, here was this woman, someone with no formal training, no higher education, coming into his space and solving a problem that many students would have struggled with. It was enough to make him feel uneasy. He cleared his throat again, this time trying to regain some of his old confidence. "I must admit, Mary," he said, his tone now a little more respectful, "I didn't expect you to be able to solve that problem. It was impressive. But tell me, how did you learn to do this?" Mary hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to explain herself. She had never spoken about her love for math in public. It wasn't something she discussed openly. "I've always been interested in numbers," she said finally. "As a child, I would solve puzzles in my spare time. I never went to school for it or anything like that. I just read books and taught myself." Mr. Thompson looked at her with a mix of awe and disbelief. "You taught yourself," he repeated, almost as if the idea was foreign to him. He was used to thinking that knowledge came from years of formal education, not self-study. "But how could you have learned something so complex on your own?" Mary shrugged, her eyes still focused on the chalkboard. "It's not as hard as it seems once you start understanding the patterns," she said. "I didn't really learn it in a classroom, but I've always had a curiosity about how things work. And math, well, math just made sense to me. It's like a language, and once you start speaking it, you can understand it better." Her words left Mr. Thompson speechless. He had spent years trying to teach his students the language of math, and yet here was someone who had learned it without formal instruction, without the prestige of a degree or the authority of a classroom. It was a humbling realization for him. As the minutes passed, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but the whispers continued. People were still talking about what had just happened. Some were amazed, while others were skeptical. But one thing was clear: no one would ever look at Mary the same way again. The simple secretary from the office had proven that true genius didn't always come from formal education or prestigious backgrounds. Sometimes, it came from a quiet passion, a love for learning that didn't need validation from others. Mr. Thompson stood silently, his mind racing. He had been so sure of his own superiority, so convinced that his education and experience made him untouchable. But now, standing before Mary, he realized how wrong he had been. She had shown him that intelligence couldn't be measured by degrees or titles. It could come from anywhere, and in this case, it had come from a woman who had spent her life quietly solving puzzles that no one else had bothered to notice. He had no words to say to her. All he could do was nod slowly, acknowledging the lesson he had just learned. And though he didn't know it yet, this moment would change him forever. Advanced operations that were sure to stump her. The audience gathered around, curious about what was about to unfold. Some of them chuckled quietly, thinking that Mary would struggle and that Mr. Thompson would get another chance to show off his expertise. The crowd didn't seem to take her seriously. She wasn't a scholar or a teacher, just an ordinary woman, so how could she possibly solve such a challenging problem? Mary took a moment to look at the equation on the board. Her brow furrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in concentration. She didn't react as most would. Instead of panicking, she stood still, looking at the problem with quiet focus. There was no rush, no need to hurry. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her, but they didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the problem in front of her. Mr. Thompson had already started to explain the first steps of the problem to the crowd, assuming Mary wouldn't be able to keep up. He spoke loudly, almost as though he was lecturing to the room rather than guiding her. You see, the first part is simple. We need to find the value of x. This type of equation is something all math students learn after just a few lessons, he said, looking over his shoulder with a smug expression. Mary remained silent. She wasn't bothered by the teacher's words. Instead, she began working in her mind, thinking through the problem methodically. She had seen equations like this before, though she had never been formally taught. Over the years, she had developed a love for solving math problems, in particular. She would read books and work through exercises, teaching herself how to approach various types of equations. It was a hobby, really. She didn't consider herself a genius. She just enjoyed solving puzzles. As Mr. Thompson continued speaking to the audience, Mary quietly began to write on the chalkboard. Her hand moved steadily, and every stroke was deliberate. She worked through the first part of the problem with ease. Step by step, she tackled each part of the equation, manipulating the numbers and symbols with a level of precision that didn't go unnoticed. The people around her started to fall silent, watching in confusion as she moved through the problem without hesitation. The crowd had expected her to fumble or freeze up, but instead, she looked completely comfortable. There was something strangely captivating about the way she worked through the problem. The audience was starting to notice that she wasn't just guessing, she was solving the problem with clarity and confidence. Mr. Thompson's voice grew quieter as he turned his attention back to Mary. He had been explaining, but now he was focused on her movements. The smugness on his face began to fade. This wasn't what he had expected. He had assumed she would struggle, but she was doing the work with ease, without hesitation. There was a quiet elegance in the way she solved the problem that left him slightly shaken. He began to doubt his initial judgment. Could it be that she actually understood what she was doing? As Mary reached the final part of the equation, she paused for just a moment. She looked at the board and double-checked her work, ensuring every step was correct. Then, with the final stroke of the chalk, she wrote down the answer. The room went completely still. There was no sound, no applause, just stunned silence. Mr. Thompson walked slowly toward the board. He looked at the answer and then back at Mary. It was correct. She had solved the problem flawlessly, and with a level of precision that he had not expected. For a brief moment, he stood there, unable to speak. The audience, too, seemed to be in shock. Some of them exchanged glances, not sure how to react. It was as though the room had just experienced something unexpected, something extraordinary. Mary turned toward the crowd with a soft smile. I hope that answers your question, she said, her voice still calm and composed. Mr. Thompson, struggling to regain his composure, nodded slowly. He had no words to respond, only a stunned silence. He realized now that Mary was not just some ordinary woman. She had just proven him wrong in front of everyone. He wasn't sure how to feel, whether embarrassed, humbled, or amazed. Perhaps a little bit of all three.